Well, happy Wednesday afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. It's a beautiful day outside, and I really appreciate you guys spending some time indoors to talk today about ponds. My name is James Stevenson, and I'm bringing you Florida Supernature as a part of the University of Florida IFAS extension here in Pinellas County. Today's topic, of course, is going to be on ponds, so a bit of a specialized topic today. And again, I appreciate you guys signing up for something as arguably as obscure as an hour on ponds. So here's a little introduction to the current series of Florida Supernature.
3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to Florida Supernature. I'm James Stevenson with the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences here in Pinellas County, coming to you from Brooker Creek Preserve. This month, we're going to focus on Brooker Creek's wetlands. We're going to explore a cypress dome, a very special small wetland. We'll look at man-made wetlands, channels that cut through the preserve that channel the water where humans want it to go. We'll look at a pond ecosystem, and we'll finish up in the flooded forest. All different wetlands in one preserve. So we hope you enjoy our series, Florida Supernature, as we explore the wetlands here in Pinellas County.
And we're so lucky to have access to these wonderful fresh water wetland systems. A couple have asked questions in the past few weeks about what about marine wetlands and marine systems. And so hopefully we can partner with our sister preserve, Weeden Island Preserve, to explore some of those wonderful habitats maybe next year, which is fast upon us. So let's have a look at Wetlands 101. The university tends to characterize wetlands as they fall into a couple of different definitions. Wetlands can be swamps, marsh, lake, pond, river, based on the hydrology, which is, the $20 word of the day, the hydrology, how the water exists and or doesn't move through the system, how the water is introduced to the system, the source of that water, the speed at which the water exits that system, the depth of the water in a particular area. So the hydrology, the overarching, the way that water exists, the overarching, I'm looking for the word, it'll probably come around 4 o'clock this morning. So the hydrology determines the nature of these different particular wetlands, but all wetlands have some basic characteristics. They have a hydric soil. That means that the soil is mud. Muddy soil, the particles tend to be very small, silty particles, lots of organics. So small particles, saturated particles, the makeup of the indicator species of both plants and animals can help determine what is defined as a proper wetland. So the wildlife, there are certain species that depend on wetlands for at least part of their life cycle. Amphibians, of course, they all return to water to reproduce. Amphibians can live in and out of water. And here we have a nice little spokes amphibian, a frog with a crown of a floating plant called duckweed, actually a flowering plant that also depends on water, depends on a wetland to exist. So the presence of a species like this frog and the presence of a species like this duckweed can help us determine that the piece of land that we're sitting in is in fact a proper wetland. A swamp is a wetland that is dominated by trees, hardwood trees. In this case, this is a photograph off the boardwalk here at Brooker Creek, not far from the Education Center buildings. And you can see these hardwoods, primarily tupelo and sweet bay. There's also some holly mixed in there and buttonbush. So this is a swamp, a flooded forest, if you will, which we'll examine next week. Marsh, these tend to be found more in estuary or estuarine situations. A marsh is a wetland whose dominant vegetation is not trees. You can see those plants that are kind of acting like trees in this photograph are in fact palmettos, cabbage palms, but the dominant vegetation here is a grass, the sawgrass or the spartina that is found in more estuarine situations. Lakes, large, relatively still bodies of water. Our lake, our kind of signature lake here in North Pinellas County is of course Lake Tarpon. A pond, which we'll visit today. What's the difference between a lake and a pond? When I was growing up, I used to say I'm going down to the lake. It was nothing more than a retention pond, but to a little kid, a big pond is kind of like a lake. Anyway, so, you know, a bit subjective on where you draw the line between a pond and a lake, but my non-scientific description of the difference between a lake and a pond is that you can shout to your friend from one side of a pond to the other. You can't shout to your friend hopefully from one side of the lake to another. So a lake being a much larger body of water. We have a few rivers here in the state. Our closest major river would be the Hillsborough River, a very important wetland, of course. All these being important to the health of any ecosystem. A healthy wetland means the healthy species that are associated, but especially freshwater wetlands as sources of our drinking water. So very important to protect these precious systems. So let's take a look at a pond. This part of Florida, and as we go further east towards lake land, dotted with lots of these freshwater systems that retain water throughout the year, forming lakes and ponds. So let's just zoom in on a bit of the preserve that we're going to look at today. Hopefully you can see my cursor. This is just a Google map, and I Googled Brooker Creek, and I got all this wonderful stuff. You can see right here in the upper right-hand corner, Brooker Creek headwaters. This is actually the source of the water that flows this way west towards Lake Tarpon, defining the Brooker Creek watershed. So this area that I'm kind of outlining here is the Brooker Creek watershed, and all the water that moves through here, all the rainwater that falls in this part of Hillsborough County that moves in this direction, feeds into this wetland system that is referred to as Brooker Creek. And Brooker Creek exists as seeps and flows and ponds, and ultimately the large lake that we know as Lake Tarpon. But what I'd like to do is just kind of zoom in on one particular part of the preserve that we're going to take an in-depth look at. So again, we're going to zoom in and try not to make you seasick or airsick, I guess would be the case. As we zoom in, if you visited the preserve, you know, you turn in here off of Keystone Road, there's a picture of the entrance, and you drive in, and through these forests, you probably don't even realize that you're driving past these little ponds. See, I could stand here and yell at somebody over here. So that's how I define these as ponds. So standing water, freshwater systems. What we're going to do is, this is the road. We're going to pull in right here, this little patch of sand right here. And our friend Shannon Brewer with Tarpon Springs is going to take us off on a flight across these two freshwater systems. And then we're going to get in and have a look and see what we can find in there. So let's just knock this out and carry on with our magic carpet ride. Okay. So here we're going to zoom up over the upland, the oak hammock, but without very much elevation change. You see standing water. So that would be the water table. The water in this part of Florida, not very far beneath the surface. So surrounded by dry lands, upland. You can even see the white sands of these upland systems. The pines loving their dry habitats. But as we get closer to this standing water, this small little pond, you see the concentric rings of vegetation. And that vegetation, those indicator species, help define the beginning and the end of this tiny little wetland known as the pond. Varying types of vegetation. As we fly over, you can see the trees. I'm sure you can see the trees, but I'll just interpret some of these. The very dark green, as you see dotted through here, these little meatball shapes, those are our oak trees. Throughout, the closer you get towards the water's edge, these very pale kind of apple green lollipops, if you will, those are our cypress. And if you remember from the cypress dome, the cypress can tolerate a higher level, a higher water table than our oak species. It's not that it would necessarily kill the oak species, but the cypress trees are able to grow better and faster, and therefore they can outcompete the other species. So we have upland species, the oaks, just a little bit of elevation downwards. We have more standing water. We have the more tolerant species, the cypress here. And then as we get even closer to the standing water, a bit too deep for even the cypress, either to have gotten established or to either to have gotten established in the first place or to have survived from the seedling stage to the adult. And we move into a more herbaceous layer. We get into the sawgrass. There are still some woody plants through here, including the willows and the buttonwood. Further into the freshwater system, you can see the floating plants, and we'll take a closer look at that. And as we gaze out across the landscape, again, you can see the cypress indicating more hydric conditions. And then we have an area of disturbed. All of this is mowed. You can see we're butting up against a slightly developed area. And even there, we have a couple of patches of standing water. So that's just to get your orientation, the two wetlands that we're going to take a look at today. Actually, while Shannon was flying over, I'm going to go ahead and admit this. Shannon was doing an excellent job of navigating, and I was crashing around in here somewhere trying to find the edge of the pond. So completely lost my bearings, had no idea where I was. Wished that I had been in this eagle eye. So I'm down here somewhere in a white shirt. But anyway, eventually we found where we were going, and we were able to jump into the water and bring you the following.
All right, so here we are in the pond. Lots to talk about right here. Now, we mentioned the nature of the various wetlands that we're studying this month. We looked at a cypress dome, not a particularly deep body of water, but it's defined by the predominant vegetation, of course, being the cypress. We had a look at the ditches, the waterways, the various areas of water that come and go according to the rainfall in the season. So seasonally dry, seasonally inundated. Where we are now is a proper pond. So a pond, in my definition, the way that I define them, is a body of still or extremely slow moving water that's relatively spherical in shape that you can actually shout across. The difference between a pond and a lake, to me, is that you can't shout across a lake. So we'll call this a pond. Now there's no real Brooker Pond. The name of today's presentation is on Brooker Pond. Just a play on the words of the famous movie from the early 1980s. But anyway, here we are in a proper pond. So if you look across to the other side, you can see the cypress, and they're adapted to life at a certain depth of water. Where it gets to be a little bit too deep for the cypress, either to have become established or to have carried out their entire lives, we move into more adapted woody plants like the willows and the buttonbush. Closer into the water, we give way to some herbaceous plants like I'm surrounded by here, the sedges. And you can see these lovely deep green sedges, the smaller species, and the ones with a little bit bluer and taller emergent leaves, the sawgrass. Now, its common name is sawgrass, but it's technically a sedge. It doesn't really matter all that much when you're observing from a distance, but it really does live up to its name sawgrass when you're walking through it. You get cut to ribbons. So sawgrass and these sedges, these are referred to as emergent vegetation. There's different kinds of vegetation that exist in ponds. There's the marginal species, the emergent species, the ones that are rooted in the mud, but they pop out and stand proud of the water surface. There are plants that are actually rooted into the mud and they just float on the surface, the floating vegetation. And a representative here is the spatterdock. A lot of people think that a broad-leafed floating plant would be a water lily, and you certainly would be forgiven to referring to this plant as a water lily, but technically folks call this spatterdock. It has a yellow flower that never really opens all that fully. It's got the three outer sepals and the three bright yellow petals, making it a monocot, of course. Flower parts in threes. We have the stamens all around the outside here and a huge stigmatic surface that covers the entire top of the center section of this flower. Bees navigating their way across the landscape, across the pond, they can find their way to these flowers, collect their nectar reward, land on the flower, do the pollen transfer. Here's a flower that's been pollinated. Now the petals are going to begin to fall away. You can see the very well developed stamens just here. Their job is probably done. Stigmatic surface, having received pollen from a different plant. Eventually, all those parts are going to fall away. The ovary is going to begin to develop. And these plants have got a really great survival technique. Once the flower's been pollinated and the fruit begins to develop, the stem that supports the fruit bends and starts pushing the fruit underwater, so that when the seeds are released, they're going to go right into the mud so they can establish and send their leaves all the way up from the bottom of the pond. You can see this pond is about a meter and a half tall, according to where my waist is. Spatterdock is characterized by these yellow kind of club-shaped flowers that never really fully open. They're not as fully open as the water lilies. Sometimes their leaves stand up above the water like this. Again, if it's important to you, those are some ways to tell the difference between the spatterdock and the water lily. Another difference is in the shape of the leaves. This is a water lily proper. And here's the spatterdock. Spatterdock being a much more pointy leaf. The lobes here where I'm running my thumb, they're rounded, whereas in a water lily, they're pointed. Of course, you can learn more about that in our UF-IFAS textbook, This or That, A Beginner's Guide to Commonly Misidentified Species. Another floating plant that's not anchored to the ground. We'll explore this a little bit later in a upcoming presentation. This is one of the carnivorous plants. This is a plant called bladderwort. Wort being kind of an old-fashioned word for plant. So the bladder plant, and the reason it's called that is because its leaves, they're not used to collect the sunlight and wave around in the air. Not just that, their leaves are reduced to this mesh, this network that can photosynthesize, but the leaves are also equipped with little bladders. Perhaps you can see some swellings in this massive leaves. I can see some here. Might get a better look through there. The little swellings. So these are the leaves of the bladderwort. They use the leaves to float. They use the leaves to collect sunlight, to turn into carbohydrates, but most sinisterly, they use their leaves, and in particular, small bladders, small vacuum chambers that they produce along their leaves that when triggered can pull microorganisms or even some macroorganisms into the hollow bladders. Its prey, if you will, then dies, and in decomposing releases essential nitrogen, which the plant can use to facilitate its further growth. And if you look just in the distance, the tiny little flowers that are sticking their heads up over the top of the water, those are all bladderwort flowers. Now, what good is a carnivorous plant if you're trying to be pollinated? That's why the flowers are produced up high. They're produced well above where those hungry leaves are. So the pollinators can visit these flowers, pollinate just like we saw in the spatterdock, taking the pollen from one flower, depositing it on the other. And after that happens, the fruit develops. And here we have the developing fruit of a bladderwort. So again, you can see this plant is beginning to turn the little stem that supported the flowers, presenting it to the pollinators. Now it's facing downwards, so it'll be dropping its seeds right in the water where they can germinate and grow into another generation of bladderwort.
So we met a few species within that small little bit of that pond. Wanted to just move out a little bit deeper and see what else we can find. I do need to mention the name of that book that's available from the IFAS bookstore is This or That, A Beginner's Guide to Commonly Confused, Commonly Misidentified Species of Plants and Animals. Okay.
3, 2, 1.
So the depth of this little pond at its deepest is probably no more than, say, 7 to 10 feet, but that's just enough to draw the line for certain species. Now, the levels of this pond could have come and gone over the years, but eventually it settled into the configuration that we have today. The shoreline will come and go according to rainfall, but generally this pond holds the same amount of water throughout the year. At some point, that overwhelmed a woody plant that had become established, had come to be full grown, but then things changed, drainage changed, something like that. We're never sure of what ecological reasons these things happen, but you can see a stump right out there towards the center. It became just a little bit too much for that species to bear, and we're left with kind of the corpse of an established woody plant. Looks to me like a willow or a button bush. That'd be my guess.
One.
Here's a shrub that doesn't mind having its feet wet year-round. This is button bush. Now it produced those really funny spherical orbs of tiny white flowers, kind of looking like the Sputnik satellite from many, many years ago. This is the resulting cluster of individual little fruits. So each one of those white flowers produced one of these little swellings that you can see growing on this spherical infructescence at this point. It's no longer an inflorescence, it's an infructescence. So here we are at the end of the year. These fruits will ripen, drop off into the water, hopefully drift away and grow us another button bush. Opposite leaves, it's related to coffee and a couple other plants that we're quite familiar with. You can see this is one of the colonizers towards the edge of the pond across the way as we transition from the cypress swamp more into the open pond area. Snap. So we mentioned the sawgrass earlier. Why would you want to have these horrible, serrated, flesh-tearing leaves? Probably to protect your developing fruit. And you can see the sawgrass has flowered, and here it is, the end of the year. It's flowered, it's gone into fruit, and it's shed that fruit. It has shed those seeds, being very well protected by these basically serrated knives that surround the developing seed here. The seed matured and dropped onto the pond surface. From there, the wind's going to take it to shore, someplace where there's mud where the seeds can germinate. So that's actually water dispersed. It's had the water move the seeds away from the parent plant so it can germinate and start a new sawgrass plant. Other mechanisms take advantage of the air currents. This vine with its little white flowers, once they've been visited, pollinated, and the fruit develops, the resulting fruit are on little parachutes. And so the wind, in today's kind of a breezy day, when the fruits mature, the wind carries them off. Again, hopefully finding some nice, suitable, muddy ground where those seeds can germinate, take hold, and produce another one of our climbing hemp vine, hemp, H-E-M-P, hemp vine. It's actually a sunflower relative. It might look a little bit familiar to some, the blue mist flower that it's related to, but it's an actual climbing vine. Perhaps the most well-known dispersal mechanism for flowering plants. After their flowers have been visited, pollinated, the fertilization has taken place, the fruit is produced. Yes, a fruit that we will all recognize, the vector of the seeds inside. A juicy, edible fruit. So when people hear the word fruit, they automatically think of something, full of vitamins and fiber with the seeds inside. Now, we've looked at all kinds of other different fruits that take care of themselves without being eaten. This, of course, is the persimmon. The persimmon surrounds its seeds in a sweet flesh that actually encourages being eaten. The seeds, impervious to digestion, can pass through a digestive system and come out the other end far away from the parent plant and complete with a little bundle of fertilizer ready to grow into another persimmon tree.
So there we have a little bit of a little stomp through the pond right at the edge. Of course, Julie and I wearing our trusty waders, keeping us relatively dry as we stomped around up to about, mid-chest in the comfort of our waders. Now, we probably should have put something over the brand name because, of course, we don't advocate any particular brand of anything. other than the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, of course. So one of the reasons that we wanted to impress the different dispersal mechanisms as we looked at these various species of plants is because it would beg the question whenever you have a wetland, well, how did the plants get there in the first place? And the various dispersal mechanisms of the different species are in tune with those species finding new wetlands. In the case of the climbing vine, the Macania, that hemp vine, its seeds are carried by the air. So just by, a breeze could take even just one viable seed from the wetland that the hemp vine was growing in to a new wetland. Uh, a strong wind getting that one viable seed. It only takes one seed germinating to keep the population of hemp vine in a particular area stable. Other species like the sawgrass that are water dispersed, so their seeds are actually carried, they float, and their seeds are carried on moving water so they can flow from one part of a wetland to another part of a wetland, or from one wetland to a separate wetland, say during a flood situation. So you might have sawgrass dumping seed into the same wetland where it lives year after year. Perhaps there's not a suitable substrate for those seeds to germinate. Um, Perhaps those plants don't produce a single seed that succeeds. But in a flood year, that same sawgrass dropping some seed into the water, water rises, leaves that particular wetland situation, and that viable seed can drift far and wide and establish sawgrass somewhere else. So you can see, it takes an awful lot of chance for reproduction, and that's why plants produce so many seeds, throwing, chance to the, almost literally to the wind. And in the case of the persimmon, uh, and when we talk about flowering plants producing fruit, the persimmon producing that fruit that, non-botanists can relate to, where you've got a vector that can move from one wetland to another over land in the form of a larger animal that uses the persimmon as food. So that way, obviously, the 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 species that is using the persimmon for food obviously doesn't mind being in a wetland because they wandered into one in the first place to access that fruit. Chances are they're going to wander to another wetland and deposit the seeds of that fruit. And that is how plants can get from wetland to wetland and how they can establish within wetlands even in the first place. So let's take a look at just a couple of the species. We have, coming up, we have in the beginning of October, we're going to do a whole class on wetland wildflowers. So a lot of the pretties we looked at last week, we're going to dig in a little bit further. But when we're talking about aquatic plants, we have to categorize them as per their growth habit, not necessarily who they're related to or if they're flowering or non-flowering, but how they exist within a wetland. So aquatic plants are categorized as algae, as floating plants, as submergent plants, and as emergent plants. And we've looked at almost all of these so far. Misspoke a little tiny bit about the spatterdock, but we'll clear that up right now. So algae, of course, we hear a lot about things like algal blooms or algae blooms, pond scum, kind of demonized our algae. Algae is actually responsible for the majority of the oxygen that we breathe worldwide. So don't hate on the algae. The algae is here, thankfully, so we're here. But when you're talking about algae in an artificial wetland, an artificial freshwater wetland situation, the presence of certain species of algae can be not very aesthetic. And certain compromised freshwater systems, natural or unnatural, due to some sort of imbalance, can give the algae a benefit and at the detriment of other species. So we hear about nutrients being introduced into systems. Fertilizer runoff is probably the biggest way that nutrient is introduced artificially into systems, and that artificial nutrient can completely flip the natural balance of a wetland on its head. And it can cause the algae to quote unquote bloom, uh, not producing flowers, but rather just having an increased growth rate, which can cause a cascading effect that can lead to the death of a wetland. A situation called eutrophication, where the algae grows too fast, covers the surface of the water, shades everything out. The decomposers use up all the oxygen. Bad news. Algae is not the culprit. Algae exists naturally in a sustainable population, in consort and harmony with all the other species. It's when unnatural um, influences cause that algae to grow even faster than normal, that things get turned on their head. Microscopic, the algae are. This is a species, a lot of those floating mats of pond scum, again, they're made of filamentous algae, and this species of filamentous algae is called Spirogyra. Any New Age people remember Spirogyra? They're named after an algae. Anyway, I digress. Here we have a microscopic look at that filamentous algae, again, responsible for a lot of nutrient cycling in a healthy wetland system and for the production of the majority of the oxygen in our atmosphere. So the algae, free-floating aquatic plants with their place in the wetland system. Earlier, we looked at a floating plant. In this case, this is the duckweed, a flowering plant, a very, very, very simple flowering plant, not a primitive flowering plant, and actually quite advanced and evolved flowering plant that has actually kind of gone backwards and simplified itself into nothing more than a floating leaf and an occasional flower. The duckweed is actually related to your peace lilies, your caladiums. Who else is in that funny family? The jack in the pulpit, all these groups. So floating plants. A floating plant that's particularly troublesome is actually a fern. So as I mentioned, these growth habits have nothing to do with what plants are related to each other. It's just how they grow. And we know that ferns occupy all different kind of niches. Here is a fern that floats in freshwater systems and can cause quite a lot of trouble. But it exists unrooted, floating, free floating in freshwater systems. This one's called water spangles or salvinia, can be quite a problem, but it's a representative of a floating plant. We also have submergent vegetation or submergent plants. These are plants that are rooted to the mud underwater, and they're above ground, above mud parts, never really break the surface of the water. And there's quite a host of these plants, these submergent vegetation. This in particular is one called tape grass or turtle grass or eel grass, all these grassy grass names. It's actually not a grass at all. It belongs to the same family of flowering plants as the Alodia. What's that really, hydrilla, that really bad one? Anyway, those are examples of submergent vegetation. Emergent vegetation are those plants that are rooted in the mud, and yet emerge through the surface of the water. And I think I might have referred to the spatter dock. Here's a picture of our Brooker Pond. I might have referred to the spatter dock as a floating plant. It is not a, technically, ecologically speaking, it's not a floating plant. It's an emergent. It's rooted in the bottom, and its leaves do break the surface. So here you can see the spatter dock. Even though they're floating, they're still rooted in the mud. So those are the emergent vegetation. The majority of the plants that you see, of course, are going to be the emergent. The sedges, the water lilies, the spatter dock, and etc. So those are the different classifications of pond vegetation. Uh, the algae, the floating plants, the submerged, and the emerged plants. All very much in harmony and consort based on the water levels, based where they can particularly compete. They all find their place and provide for a healthy ecosystem. The developing fish, the young fish can find refuge both in the submerged plants, in the roots of the floating plants, amongst the branches and blades of the emergent vegetation. Larger predators can take part in all of that. So the whole chain, the whole food web existing when you have a healthy kind of radius of vegetation types surrounding a pond or really any wetland. The majority of our wetlands, excuse me, the majority of our ponds, remember pond, the unofficial definition being those small bodies of water that you can kind of wave to your friend across. Unfortunately, the majority of our little ponds are man-made and devoid of this vegetation, these various zones of vegetation from the upland down into the water, both floating, submerged, and emergent vegetation. People tend to like to mow all the way down to the edge. And so that removes those layers of filtration. They remove the layers of protection for vertebrate and invertebrate species of animals. This is one of the reasons of the upending of the natural nutrient cycle within a pond. We get things like the algae perhaps taking over. This picture, you can see lawns right down to the edge of this pond. Lawns probably being fertilized, right? And so you can see the conduit between the lawn and the pond is gone. The fertilizer is going to go straight into the pond, and that whole imbalance begins where you have that nutrient imbalance, the eutrophication. People come in and they think that adding a fountain is going to solve the problem. We're going to have a nice healthy pond if we put in what people believe and are sold the idea of an aerator, and that if you put more oxygen into the system, you're going to solve all the problems of the world. Really what these fountains do is rapidly evaporate the water in these small bodies of water. So throwing this mist up into the air in the summertime, you're basically just emptying out your little pond. So the pond is compromised to begin with, and then we go in and use electricity to evaporate the pond even faster. No favors being done there. So let's take a look. Again, we're going to zoom in. I'll try not to make you seasick. And without any judgment calls, not judging, just pointing out how you can see, even from space, the difference between a natural pond and a kind of a human curated pond, I'll put it that way. So the little ponds that we looked at here in Brooker, I'll say we, but it's not, I'm using the royal we. James, I don't know if this little pond that we observed earlier was natural, if it's just one of the many spherical sinkholes that we have throughout this area. We did see the Cypress Dome that existed in what I believed to have been a small sinkhole. It's very possible that this depression was caused by a sinkhole that resulted in this little pond. Not having been here since the beginning of time, I'm not sure that this wasn't human created. It's possible that somewhere in the mists of time, uh, dirt, quote unquote, was needed to change the elevation of a bit of land, and this could have been excavated. So, topsoil or dirt or whatever you want to call it may have been excavated from this area, resulting in a man-made pond, and we'll put it that way. It doesn't really matter because whatever the source of this standing small body of fresh water, those wetland species found their level and found their place and created those zones of vegetation that eventually led to the creation of an in balance natural wetland, freshwater wetland ecosystem. So even if these wetlands or these little ponds were man-made, being left to their own devices, and in the absence of that fertilizer runoff and all that nonsense, they established themselves as a healthy pond that's indistinguishable from those vegetation zones and those indicator species that you would find in a natural pond. We'll just zoom in. So we have the preserve here, and we're surrounded by development, right? So we have developments with varying names surrounding the preserve. And if you I'm not going to go there. I want to go to here's where I want to go. So we have these developments with the names and all the houses, and they have these fancy names. And we'll just kind of zoom in on either a natural or a man-made little pond. And what do we have here? We have a pond. This could be a retention pond where the runoff from the land and the development goes into this freshwater system to be filtered before it enters a system, and that, of course, filters the runoff, the pollution, and that sort of thing. But what do we see a lack of around the edges here? We have a missing zone of vegetation types. What do we also see a lack of? We don't have any floating vegetation. We don't have any emergent vegetation. And I'd hazard to say we don't have any submerged vegetation either. If any algae were to get established in here, perhaps the residents of this particular area might decide that that's not a desirable thing and might go in and clear it out. So what we have here is an out of balance freshwater pond system. So again, even if the little pond about the same size that we explored, now I'm lost and seasick, where we go? Right. Even if this little pond about the same size, even if that was human-made, like the one that we just observed, this one has found, the species have found their level and have established a healthy system. So the takeaway message to take to your homeowners association, if you have that, to any pond that has within your sphere of influence, is to encourage those wetland plants to find their ground, to establish healthy filtration systems. You can take advantage, if you're in unincorporated Pinellas County, you can certainly search for the Adopt a Pond program. If you're just curious and want to study more about these plants, these systems, how retention ponds work, look for Adopt a Pond in Pinellas County and learn more about that very, very important program that we're happy to support and mention as we can. So that is a look at one of the ponds here in Brooker Creek. And we certainly had fun. The whole Florida Supernature team had fun putting the series together, especially jumping into the pond and getting up to our chest and waders. Next week, we're going to finish up with the flooded forest, and we're going to have a walk through the flooded forest, the dominant wetland ecosystem here at Brooker Creek. We are primarily the flooded forest, dominated by, well, I'm not going to tell you. I've already told you once. We're going to explore this more next week. The species of trees and all of those species that take advantage of the real estate that those trees in the flooded forest provide. So thanks very much for joining us today. Going to let you out about 10 minutes early. Go out and enjoy this beautiful weather, and hopefully we'll see you next week.